The alarm cut through the training hall before I even opened my eyes, and I already knew this morning would not be like the others. My name is Callum Hart, and I was the only human in a room full of alien cadets who had spent their entire lives being told that my species was an afterthought in the history of war. I did not argue with them. I let them believe it. Belief is a weapon, and I had learned that lesson long before I ever set foot on this station. The lights above the barracks flared red, and Sergeant Vraketh's voice boomed through every speaker at once, sharp enough to make even the toughest cadets flinch. Formation. Now. No excuses. I was already moving before the second word finished. My boots hit the cold floor. My uniform was on in seconds, and I was standing in line before most of the others had even rolled out of their bunks. Vraketh liked to test us at the worst possible moments, and today was clearly one of those days. He walked down the row of cadets like a predator inspecting prey, his 4 eyes scanning each of us in turn. Vraketh was Dracian, a species built for war the way sharks are built for the ocean. His race had fought in more conflicts across more star systems than any other species in the coalition, and he wore that history like armor. Scars ran across his jaw in patterns that told stories only his own kind could read. When his gaze landed on me, it lingered a little longer than it did on the others. "Cadet Hart," he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge that never quite disappeared. "Your species joined this coalition only a few decades ago, yet here you stand, pretending you belong among warriors." I kept my eyes forward and said nothing. Silence was often the safest answer. "Your kind talks about peace treaties," he continued, pacing in front of us. "Diplomacy, mercy, soft words for soft creatures who fear the cost of true war." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the other cadets. I did not react. Reacting was exactly what he wanted. "Today, you will learn what mercy actually costs," Vraketh said, his voice dropping into something colder. "You will learn that hesitation is not kindness. Hesitation is death, and death is the only lesson that matters out here." He stopped in front of me again, close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the hall lights in his dark eyes. "When I give an order for no mercy," he said slowly, "I expect no mercy. Not weakness disguised as strategy, not soft human sentiment. Total, complete, no mercy." I held his gaze for exactly as long as respect required, then looked forward again. "Understood, Sergeant," I said. He grunted, unconvinced, and moved on to address the rest of the cadets. What Vraketh did not know, what none of them knew, was that humanity's history was not soft. It was not gentle. It was not built on hesitation. My people had learned brutal lessons about war long before we ever left our own solar system, and those lessons were burned into every strategy course, every training simulation, every tactical doctrine we carried into the stars. We did not fear conflict. We understood it in ways these warrior cultures had never needed to, because we had survived wars that nearly erased us entirely. Mercy, in human terms, was never about weakness. It was about efficiency. It was about ending a fight before it could spiral into something neither side could control. But explaining that to a Dracian sergeant who measured strength by scars and bravado would have been like explaining color to someone who had never seen light. Some lessons had to be shown, not spoken. The training hall doors opened, and Vraketh gestured for us to follow him into the briefing room. My squad included 5 other cadets, each from different corners of the coalition. Nadia Colton walked beside me, her expression unreadable, though I had come to recognize the slight tension in her jaw whenever Vraketh singled someone out. Beside her was Owen Drayton, tall and confident, the kind of cadet who never doubted his own instincts, even when he probably should have. The rest of the squad filed in behind us, silent and alert. Nobody spoke during Vraketh's briefings unless spoken to first. Inside the briefing room, a holographic display flickered to life above the central table, showing a detailed simulation map. A fortified structure sat at the center, surrounded by defensive positions, patrol routes, and a small garrison of simulated enemy forces. Your first combat simulation, Vracath announced, his tone shifting into something more formal, more commanding. A hostile stronghold. Your objective is simple. Eliminate all resistance. No survivors, no exceptions. He turned to face us fully now, his arms crossed behind his back. This is not a game, he said. This is preparation for war. Out there, enemies will not wait for you to feel comfortable with your choices. They will not pause while you weigh the cost of mercy. You strike first, you strike hard, and you leave nothing behind that can strike back. His eyes moved across the room, pausing briefly on each cadet before settling once more on me. Cadet Hart, he said, your species prides itself on clever thinking. Let us see if cleverness survives contact with real consequences. I did not answer immediately. I was already studying the map above the table, noting the layout of the enemy compound, the patrol schedules, the visible supply routes leading in and out of the structure. While Vracath spoke about mercy and weakness, my mind was already working through a dozen different approaches, discarding the loud and obvious ones in favor of something quieter, something smarter. Understood, Sergeant, I said finally. Vracath studied me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether my calm was confidence or something else entirely. Then he turned back to the display. You have 6 hours to prepare a strategy, he said. The simulation begins at dawn. Dismissed. The room emptied quickly, cadets breaking into small groups to discuss tactics, most of them already leaning toward the kind of direct assault that Vracath's own species favored. Overwhelming force, frontal advance, speed and aggression above all else. I stayed behind a moment longer, staring at the holographic map, memorizing every detail before the display powered down. Nadia lingered near the door, watching me with quiet curiosity. You're not going to charge in with everyone else, are you? She said. It was not really a question. No, I said. I don't think that's the smart way to survive this. She raised an eyebrow. The sergeant wants results. Loud, obvious results. That's what impresses him. Results don't have to be loud to be effective, I said. Sometimes the quiet approach works better. It just doesn't look as impressive from the outside. Nadia considered that for a moment, then shrugged. Just don't get us killed trying to prove a point. I don't intend to, I said. I intend to make sure nobody gets killed at all, on either side of that simulation. She gave me a strange look, somewhere between doubt and curiosity, before turning and walking out of the room. I stood alone for a few more minutes, replaying the layout of the compound in my mind, calculating angles, timing, and possibilities. Vracath wanted to see what happened when human strategy met real consequences. He was about to learn that humanity's idea of no mercy looked nothing like what he expected, and everything like the kind of lesson history had already taught my species the hard way. The simulation would begin at dawn, and by the time it ended, Vracath would understand that mercy was never the opposite of no mercy. It was simply a different way of achieving the exact same outcome, without wasting a single life that did not need to be spent. I walked back toward the barracks alone, already forming the outline of a plan that would either prove my point or cost me everything in front of the entire squad. There was no room left for hesitation now. The lesson had already begun, whether Vracath realized it or not. Dawn came fast, and with it came the low hum of the simulation chamber powering up around us. The chamber was massive, a dome large enough to project an entire battlefield with terrifying accuracy. Fake terrain rose and fell beneath our boots. Dust kicked up in the artificial wind, and somewhere in the distance, the outline of the enemy stronghold waited exactly where the holographic map had shown it the night before. Vracath stood on an elevated platform above the chamber, watching through a reinforced window, his arms folded behind his back. He would see everything, every decision, every mistake. My squad gathered near the starting point, weapons loaded with simulation rounds designed to register hits without causing real harm, though the pain feedback from a direct hit was enough to make anyone think twice before taking unnecessary risks. Owen Drayton crouched beside me, checking his rifle for the third time in as many minutes. "Straight assault," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Fast, loud, overwhelming. That's how we win this. That's how you get half the squad marked down as casualties before you even reach the front gate," I said quietly. He glanced at me, unimpressed. "You have a better idea, Hart." "I do," I said, "but it's not going to look impressive." He snorted and looked away, clearly unconvinced. Nadia caught my eye from a few feet away, waiting to see what I would actually do once the simulation began. The countdown reached 0, and the chamber's speakers announced the start of the exercise. Most of the squad moved immediately toward the front of the compound, following the instincts drilled into them by cultures that measured courage by how directly you walked into danger. I let them go. Their noise would serve a purpose, even if they did not realize it yet. I moved in the opposite direction, circling wide toward the rear of the simulated compound, staying low along a ridge of artificial rock that offered decent cover from the patrol routes I had memorized the night before. My tablet buzzed quietly against my wrist, displaying a live feed of the compound's simulated communication network, something the system allowed cadets to access if they were clever enough to locate the access point without triggering an alarm. I found it exactly where I expected, hidden behind a maintenance panel near the compound's water reclamation unit. Within minutes, I had rerouted the compound's internal water supply, cutting it off from the main garrison barracks and redirecting it toward an unused storage tank far from where the defenders would think to look. It would take the simulated enemy commanders time to notice the shortage, and by then, other problems would already be piling up. Next, I intercepted their communication frequency, feeding false orders into their internal channels. I told half their patrol units to reposition toward a non-existent threat on the northern perimeter, drawing them away from the areas where my squad would eventually need to move. From the front of the compound, gunfire echoed through the chamber as Owen and the others engaged the outer defenses head-on. It was loud, chaotic, and exactly the kind of distraction I needed. While their attention focused entirely on the noise, I slipped through a maintenance corridor near the rear, disabling 2 guards with clean, precise moves before they even realized I was there. I moved deeper into the compound, watching confusion spread among the simulated defenders as their water access failed. Their communication orders contradicted each other, and their patrol routes collapsed into disarray. Panic, even simulated panic, spreads faster than any bullet. By the time I reached the central command post, the compound's morale algorithms had already registered a significant drop in defender cohesion. Simulated soldiers began abandoning their posts, some surrendering outright to avoid what the system now calculated as an unwinnable situation. I stepped into the command post just as the last defender raised his hands, the simulation registering a full surrender without a single additional shot required from my position. Outside, the sounds of gunfire slowly died down as the front assault team pushed through the now weakened outer defenses, the defenders there equally disorganized and demoralized by the chaos I had created from within. Within 20 minutes, the simulation registered complete success. Objective secured, compound neutralized, human squad losses 0, enemy losses minimal, the majority reduced to surrender rather than elimination. The chamber lights brightened, and the artificial terrain began to fade back into the smooth gray floor of the simulation dome. Vrocket's voice crackled through the speakers, tight with barely restrained anger. "Assemble, immediately." We gathered near the center of the chamber, some of the cadets still catching their breath from the frontal assault, others glancing at me with expressions somewhere between confusion and reluctant curiosity. Vrocket descended from the platform, his footsteps heavy and deliberate as he crossed the chamber floor toward us. He stopped directly in front of me, his 4 eyes narrowed into something close to disbelief. "Explain yourself, Cadet Hart," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I completed the objective, Sergeant," I said calmly. "The compound was neutralized. My squad suffered 0 losses." "You did not fight," he snapped. You hid, you manipulated, you let others take the risks while you crept through shadows. I disrupted their water supply, jammed their communications, and spread confusion through false orders, I said. By the time our squad engaged directly, the enemy's ability to resist had already collapsed. That is not weakness, Sergeant. That is efficiency. His jaw tightened. This is not how war is fought. With respect, Sergeant, I said, this is exactly how many wars have been fought, and won, without unnecessary losses on either side. A few of the other cadets shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether to side with Vroketh's fury or the undeniable results displayed on the simulation readout above us. Nadia stepped forward slightly, her voice steady. Sergeant, the objective was completed. No human losses, minimal enemy losses. By every measurable standard, this was a success. Vroketh turned his glare toward her, and for a moment I thought he might reprimand her as well. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Success without honor, he said, is hollow. Honor, I said carefully, means different things to different people, Sergeant. To my species, honor often means protecting the people under your command, even if that means choosing tactics that do not look glorious on a battlefield. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind centuries of warrior culture that valued direct confrontation above almost everything else. You call this mercy, he said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less intense. Letting them surrender instead of overwhelming them completely. I call it no mercy toward their ability to fight, I said. I did not need to remove everyone from the field to accomplish that. Mercy and effectiveness are not always opposites, Sergeant. Sometimes they are the exact same thing. Vroketh said nothing for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly across the rest of the squad before returning to me. Something in his expression had shifted, though I could not yet tell whether it was respect, suspicion, or simply confusion at a philosophy so different from everything his own culture had taught him. This conversation is not finished, Cadet Hart, he said finally, his voice carrying a warning edge. You will have another opportunity to prove whether this was skill or simply luck that will not survive a harder test. I look forward to it, Sergeant, I said. He turned sharply and walked away, barking orders for the squad to reset for evaluation debriefing, leaving me standing in the center of the chamber with the weight of his suspicion still hanging in the air. Owen approached slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something more thoughtful. That was not what I expected, he admitted. It rarely is, I said. That's usually the point. Nadia walked up beside him, glancing toward the door where Vroketh had disappeared. He's not going to let this go easily. I don't expect him to, I said. Some lessons take more than one demonstration before they actually land. As the squad dispersed toward the debriefing hall, I remained behind for a moment, staring at the simulation readout, still glowing faintly above the chamber floor. 0 losses. Objective complete. A quiet victory that looked nothing like the loud, aggressive warfare Vroketh had spent his entire career mastering. I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a much harder argument, one that would not be settled with words alone, but with results that could not be dismissed as luck, coincidence, or clever manipulation of a single controlled scenario. Vroketh wanted proof that human strategy could survive real pressure, real stakes, and real consequences. I intended to give him exactly that, one demonstration at a time, until there was no doubt left in his mind about what humanity truly meant when it spoke of no mercy. 3 days passed before Vroketh called us back into the briefing room, and this time his expression carried none of the mockery from before. Something had changed in the way he looked at me, though I could not yet tell if it was curiosity or calculation. A joint exercise has been arranged, he announced, standing before the holographic display as it flickered to life. Our squad will face a team from the Kethrian Academy, a rival institution known for producing some of the sharpest tactical minds in the coalition. The display shifted to show a wide battlefield, far larger than the compound we had faced before. Rolling hills, dense forest cover, and a river cutting through the center of the terrain gave the map an unpredictable, sprawling complexity that no simple frontal assault could easily overcome. This exercise carries live-fire conditions, Vrakith continued. Non-lethal rounds, but the impact will be significant enough to remove you from the field permanently if struck. There will be no simulated reset. Once you are marked down, you are finished for the remainder of the exercise. A murmur passed through the squad. This was no longer a simple training scenario. Reputation, standing, and pride were all on the line, and everyone in the room understood the stakes had risen considerably. The Kethrian team has already claimed victory in their last 4 exercises against visiting academies, Vrakith said, his tone carrying an edge that suggested he expected us to fail as well. They favored direct engagement, overwhelming firepower, and aggressive advances. It has served them well. His eyes settled on me, and for the first time I saw something other than pure skepticism in his expression. "Cadet Hart," he said, "your methods worked once, under controlled conditions. Let us see if they survive against opponents who are not simple programmed defenders, but living minds capable of adapting." "Understood, Sergeant," I said. "You will lead this exercise," he added, and the room went quiet. I had not expected that. Neither had anyone else, judging by the surprised glances exchanged around me. "I want to see," Vrakith said slowly, "whether your philosophy can hold together an entire squad under real pressure, or whether it only works when you are moving alone in the shadows." I felt the weight of that challenge settle over me immediately. Leading a squad meant trusting others to execute a plan they might not fully understand, against opponents who would not simply follow predictable patrol routes and predictable morale algorithms. This was no longer a controlled simulation. This was a test of whether human strategy could scale beyond a single clever infiltration. "I accept the assignment, Sergeant," I said. Vrakith nodded once, sharply. "The exercise begins in 6 hours. Prepare accordingly." The squad gathered afterward in one of the smaller planning rooms, tension evident in the way everyone sat, arms crossed, waiting for me to speak first. "I know most of you were trained to favor direct engagement," I began. "That instinct isn't wrong. Sometimes overwhelming force is exactly the right answer, but against a team that expects exactly that kind of fight, doing what they expect only helps them win faster." Owen leaned forward. "So what's the plan?" "We let them think they're winning," I said, "right up until the moment they aren't." I outlined the terrain features from the display, pointing toward the river, the forest cover, and a narrow pass between 2 hills that any aggressive commander would recognize as the fastest route to press an advantage. "The Kethrian team favors speed and pressure," I said. "If we retreat early, in a way that looks disorganized and desperate, their instincts will push them to chase that advantage as hard as possible." Nadia frowned. "You want us to look like we're losing on purpose?" "Exactly," I said. "A controlled retreat isn't weakness. It's bait. If they believe we're falling apart, they'll commit their forces faster than they should, chasing an easy victory instead of maintaining their formation." I traced a path along the narrow pass between the hills. Once they commit to the chase, this pass becomes a bottleneck. We position a small team here, using the elevation and tree cover to control the engagement from a superior position, without ever needing to match their numbers directly. Owen studied the map carefully. "And if they don't take the bait, then we adjust," I said. "But everything we know about their previous exercises suggests aggression over caution. They've won every fight by pressing hard and fast. We're simply going to use that pattern against them." I turned to Nadia. "I need a small team to hold the false retreat, just convincing enough to draw them forward without collapsing too quickly. Can you manage that?" She nodded slowly. "I can make it look real." "Owen," I continued, "you'll lead the ambush position at the pass, timing the engagement precisely once their main force is committed to the chase." "And you?" he asked. "I'll be moving independently, cutting off any secondary escape routes and disrupting their communication once the ambush begins. I said. "If any of their forces try to break away and regroup, I intend to make that as difficult as possible." The squad spent the remaining hours preparing carefully, running through timing, signals, and contingencies for every possible deviation from the plan. By the time the exercise began, everyone understood their role precisely, even if some still carried visible doubt about whether deception could truly outperform direct confrontation. The battlefield came alive around us as the exercise started, real wind cutting across open terrain, the distant sound of Kethrian forces advancing with confident, measured aggression, exactly as their reputation suggested. Nadia's team engaged first, exchanging brief, controlled fire before falling back in a retreat that looked convincingly desperate. Radio chatter from the Kethrian side grew excited almost immediately, their commanders sensing an easy opportunity and pressing their advance harder, exactly as anticipated. I moved quickly along the riverbank, staying low, monitoring the enemy's communication frequency through a small interception device concealed in my equipment. Their transmissions grew increasingly confident, coordinates shared openly as their main force surged forward in pursuit of what they believed was a collapsing opponent. As their formation stretched thin along the narrow pass, exactly as the terrain forced them to, Owen's team opened fire from the elevated position, catching the overextended Kethrian force in a crossfire they had not anticipated. Confusion spread rapidly through their ranks as simulated rounds registered hits, removing several of their most aggressive advance units from the exercise entirely within the opening minutes of the ambush. Their commander's voice cracked through the communication frequency, sharp with sudden alarm as he realized the retreat had been a deliberate lure rather than genuine weakness. Orders shouted across the channel attempted to reorganize the remaining forces, but disorganized momentum is difficult to reverse once it has already carried a formation too deep into unfamiliar terrain. I intercepted their attempt to regroup near a secondary crossing point along the river, disabling 2 of their forward scouts before they could relay updated positions back to their main force. Without accurate information, their attempts at coordination collapsed into contradictory movements, some units pressing forward while others attempted retreat, colliding with each other in the resulting confusion. Within 30 minutes, the exercise registered a decisive result. The majority of the Kethrian force had been removed from the field, their formation broken beyond effective recovery, while our own squad had sustained only minor losses among Nadia's decoy team, exactly as anticipated during the planning phase. The exercise officials called an end to the engagement, and as the artificial terrain began powering down around us, I could hear murmurs of disbelief spreading among both squads, gathering back toward the central debrief area. Vrakith stood near the observation platform, watching silently as the results scrolled across the overhead display. Kethrian losses, significant. Human squad losses, minimal. Objective, decisively achieved. The Kethrian commander approached slowly, removing his helmet with an expression somewhere between frustration and reluctant respect. He was broad-shouldered, his species built for endurance and raw strength, features weathered by years of aggressive training exactly like the reputation his team had built. "You lured us in," he said, studying me carefully, deliberately. "I did," I said. "That is not how battles are decided," he said, though his tone lacked the anger I expected. "Strength decides battles, not tricks." "Strength decides battles when both sides fight the same way," I said. "When one side changes the terms of engagement entirely, strength alone isn't always enough." He studied me a moment longer before nodding slowly, an unexpected gesture of respect crossing his weathered features. "A hard lesson," he admitted, "one I will not forget quickly." As he turned and walked back toward his own squad, I noticed Vrakith watching the exchange carefully, his expression unreadable, but his attention entirely focused on me. He crossed the field slowly, stopping a short distance away, his 4 eyes studying me with an intensity I had not seen from him before. "You risked the entire squad on a single assumption," he said, that they would chase an obvious weakness instead of maintaining discipline. I risked it on their history, I said. Every previous exercise showed the same pattern: aggression over caution. I simply used what they had already proven about themselves. And if you had been wrong? He asked. Then we would have adjusted, I said. A plan built entirely on one assumption, without contingency, is not a plan. It's a gamble. I made sure we had options if they refused to take the bait. Vrakith was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the retreating Kethrian squad before returning to me. Your species calls this mercy, he said slowly, almost to himself, ending a fight before it becomes something neither side can control. Something like that, I said. He studied me a moment longer, something shifting behind his sharp, weathered features that I could not quite identify yet. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the debrief hall, leaving me standing alone on the quiet battlefield as the last of the artificial wind settled into stillness around me. I had a feeling our next conversation would be very different from the ones that came before it. The summons came late that night, a short message on my tablet requesting my presence in Vrakith's private quarters. No explanation, no context, just a time and a location. I had never been inside a sergeant's private quarters before. Cadets rarely were, unless something serious warranted the visit. I walked the quiet corridor slowly, replaying the events of the last few days, wondering exactly what kind of conversation waited behind that door. When I arrived, Vrakith was standing near a wide viewport that looked out over the dark curve of the planet below, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid even in what should have been a private, relaxed setting. "Enter," he said without turning around. The door slid shut behind me, sealing the room into a heavy quiet. Vrakith remained facing the viewport for a long moment before finally turning to face me directly. "I have reviewed your species' history," he said, "extensively, over the last several nights." That surprised me, though I kept my expression neutral. "May I ask why, Sergeant?" "Because I do not understand you," he said, his voice carrying none of the usual sharp authority from training exercises. This was different, quieter, more genuine. Your methods work. That much is undeniable now. But I do not understand the philosophy behind them. He gestured toward a small table where a data display sat glowing faintly, images and text scrolling slowly across its surface. Fragments of human history, carefully curated, showing conflicts that had shaped the world long before we ever reached the stars. "Your history is filled with devastating wars," he said, "conflicts that nearly destroyed your civilization more than once, and yet you speak of mercy as though it were a core principle of your military doctrine." "It is," I said. "Precisely because of those wars." Vrakith's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." I stepped closer to the table, glancing briefly at the scrolling history before looking back at him. For most of human history, wars dragged on far longer than they needed to. Pride, honor, refusal to accept defeat, all of it extended suffering long past the point where the outcome had already been decided. Millions of lives lost, not because the fighting had to continue, but because neither side would allow themselves to stop. "And you believe mercy solved this," Vrakith said, though his tone carried more curiosity now than skepticism. "Mercy, as my people define it, isn't about being gentle," I said. "It's about removing sentiment from the decision to end resistance as quickly and completely as possible. The faster a conflict ends, the fewer lives it costs on both sides. We learned that lesson through devastating experience, not through comfortable theory." Vrakith studied me carefully, his expression unreadable. "Your infiltration tactics, your deception, your controlled retreats, all of this is built around ending conflict quickly." "Exactly," I said. "If I can end resistance without needless losses, whether that means disrupting supply lines, spreading confusion, or luring an aggressive enemy into a position where continued fighting becomes pointless, then that is precisely what no mercy means to my species." No mercy toward prolonging suffering, no mercy toward wasted lives, on either side. He walked slowly toward the viewport again, staring out at the planet below in silence for a long moment, before speaking again. "My people measure honor by direct combat," he said. "Standing face to face with an enemy, matching strength against strength. Retreat, deception, manipulation, these things are considered dishonorable among my kind." "I understand that," I said, "but consider what direct combat costs when both sides refuse to yield. Consider how many additional losses accumulate simply because neither side is willing to end the fight through anything other than overwhelming force." Vrakith was quiet for a long moment, his reflection faint against the viewport glass. "You are saying," he said slowly, "that what I call honor, you call unnecessary cost." "I'm saying honor and effectiveness aren't always the same thing," I said carefully. "Your species has fought countless wars across countless systems. So has mine. We simply arrived at very different conclusions about what winning actually requires." He turned to face me fully now, his 4 eyes studying me with an intensity that felt different from the suspicion he had carried during earlier evaluations. This was something closer to genuine consideration. "Explain something to me," he said. "In your first exercise, you allowed the defenders to surrender rather than eliminating them entirely. In your second exercise, you allowed the aggressive squad to overextend themselves rather than meeting them with equal force. In both cases, you achieved victory without matching your opponent's method of engagement." "That's correct," I said. "Yet you insist this is still no mercy," he said. "Explain how removing an enemy's ability to resist without physically overwhelming them qualifies as showing no mercy at all." I considered the question carefully before answering. "No mercy doesn't mean cruelty, Sergeant. It means absolute commitment to ending resistance as completely and efficiently as possible, without allowing hesitation, sentiment, or unnecessary risk to interfere with that goal. Sometimes ending resistance means overwhelming force. Sometimes it means removing an enemy's options until continued fighting becomes pointless. The method changes. The commitment to ending the conflict decisively does not." Vrakith's expression shifted slightly, something almost like understanding beginning to form behind his sharp, weathered features. "You are saying mercy, as your species defines it, is not the opposite of no mercy," he said slowly. "It is simply another expression of the same principle." "Exactly," I said. "We do not show mercy toward the enemy's ability to continue fighting. We show mercy by ending that ability as quickly and completely as possible, minimizing suffering on every side, including our own." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the data display still glowing faintly on the table between us. Fragments of human history continued scrolling slowly across the screen, conflicts that had taught my species hard lessons about the true cost of prolonged, honor-driven warfare. "My people have never needed to learn this lesson," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "Our conflicts have always been resolved through direct confrontation, strength against strength. We have never questioned whether there might be another way. Every species learns different lessons from different histories," I said. "That doesn't make one philosophy inherently superior to another. It simply means we approach the same problem from different directions." Vrakith nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back toward the viewport, toward the quiet curve of the planet, turning steadily below the station. "There is one more evaluation remaining," he said after a long silence. "A final exercise, designed to test everything you have demonstrated so far under the most demanding conditions the Academy allows." "I'm prepared for it, Sergeant," I said. He turned to face me again, something unfamiliar settling into his expression, an emotion I had not expected to see from a Drassian sergeant who had spent his entire career mocking human military philosophy as soft and hesitant. "I no longer believe your methods are luck, Cadet Hart," he said, "but belief and proof are different things. The final evaluation will determine which one truly describes what I have witnessed." "Then I look forward to settling that question, Sergeant," I said. He studied me a moment longer, then gestured toward the door, signaling the conversation had reached its natural end. "Rest while you can," he said. "The final evaluation will not offer you the comfort of a controlled simulation." I nodded once and turned to leave, the door sliding open silently ahead of me. As I stepped back into the quiet corridor, I found myself replaying our conversation carefully, aware that something fundamental had shifted between us. Vrakith no longer looked at me as a curiosity to be mocked or dismissed. He looked at me as a philosophy to be understood, tested, and ultimately judged on its own terms. Whatever the final evaluation held, I understood clearly now that it would decide far more than my own standing within the academy. It would decide whether an entire warrior culture, built across centuries of direct confrontation, could finally recognize that mercy and no mercy were never truly opposites at all. They were simply two different paths leading toward the exact same destination, ending conflict as swiftly and as completely as possible. The alarm that woke me 3 nights later was not the kind used for training exercises. I knew the difference immediately. Training alarms carried a rhythmic, deliberate pattern designed to test reaction speed under controlled conditions. This alarm was different, irregular, and urgent, the kind reserved for situations the Academy had never intended to simulate. I was in the corridor within seconds, pulling on my uniform as cadets poured out of their quarters around me, confusion and adrenaline mixing across every face I passed. Nadia caught up to me near the junction leading toward the command deck, her expression tight with the same uncertainty I felt building in my own chest. "This isn't a drill," she said, breathless. The station's outer sensors picked up an unregistered vessel approaching from outside normal patrol routes. Nobody's confirmed who they are yet. We reached the command deck just as Vrakith emerged from a side corridor, fully armed, his expression carrying none of the calculated calm from our previous conversation. This was a different version of him entirely, focused and sharp, every trace of academic curiosity replaced by pure operational urgency. "Listen carefully," he said, addressing the gathered cadets without wasting a single unnecessary word. "An unidentified vessel has bypassed our outer patrol network. Their intentions are unknown, but their approach vector suggests they are heading directly toward the Academy's primary docking structure." A holographic display flickered to life beside him, showing the vessel's position relative to the station, its trajectory locked onto a direct approach path that left little room for peaceful interpretation. "Station defense forces are currently engaged elsewhere, responding to a secondary incident near the outer relay station," Vrakith continued. "We do not have time to wait for reinforcement. This academy, and everyone aboard it, is currently our responsibility alone." The weight of that statement settled heavily across the room. This was no longer a controlled exercise designed to test our theories. This was real, immediate, and entirely unpredictable. "Cadet Hart," Vrakith said, turning toward me directly, "you have demonstrated a philosophy I did not fully understand until recently. I am placing you in command of this response." Several cadets glanced toward me, surprise evident on their faces, though none of them argued against the decision. Whatever doubts had existed before, the results of the last 2 exercises had clearly earned enough trust to make this moment possible. "Understood, Sergeant," I said, my mind already racing through the limited information available. The display showed the unidentified vessel closing distance rapidly, its configuration matching no registered coalition designs. Whoever they were, they had deliberately avoided identification protocols, which told me more about their intentions than any direct communication could have. "They're not broadcasting any standard hailing frequency," Nadia said, studying a secondary display feed. "No response to automated docking requests either." "That confirms hostile intent," Owen said grimly, checking his weapon. "It confirms they don't want to be identified," I corrected. "That's not quite the same thing, but the difference doesn't change what we need to do next." I studied the station's layout carefully, focusing on the primary docking structure the vessel appeared to be targeting. Unlike a simulated compound, this was real infrastructure, filled with cadets, instructors, and support staff who had no combat training whatsoever. "We need to buy time before they reach the docking bay," I said. "If they're planning to breach directly, we want them delayed long enough to reroute civilian personnel away from that section of the station." Vrakith nodded sharply. "What do you require?" "Access to the docking bay's environmental controls," I said, "and a small team capable of moving quickly without drawing unnecessary attention." He gestured toward a nearby console. "Explain your intention." "If I can seal off certain corridors and adjust the atmospheric pressure gradually within the docking approach tunnels, I can slow their breach attempt without triggering an immediate confrontation," I said. "It buys us time to evacuate civilian sections and position defensive personnel without forcing a direct firefight the moment they arrive." "And if they force entry before you complete this?" Vrakith asked. "Then Owen's team intercepts them at the secondary junction," I said, already tracing the path across the display. "A narrow corridor, easily defensible, far from any civilian areas." Vrakith studied the plan for only a moment before nodding firmly. "Proceed." I moved quickly toward the environmental control station, Nadia following close behind, while Owen gathered a small team to position near the secondary junction exactly as outlined. My hands moved across the console rapidly, adjusting pressure valves and sealing bulkhead doors along the vessel's projected approach path, careful to avoid triggering any automated alarms that might alert them to the deliberate delay tactics now unfolding around their approach. The unidentified vessel docked forcefully against the outer hull minutes later, the impact vibrating faintly through the station's structure. Emergency lighting flickered briefly as their breaching equipment activated against the outer airlock, exactly the section I had already adjusted to slow their progress considerably. Through the station's internal cameras, I watched their forces attempt entry, confusion evident in their movements as the environmental adjustments made their breaching process far more difficult than anticipated. Every minute of delay gave civilian personnel additional time to reach safer sections of the station, away from the immediate danger. "They're adapting," Nadia said, watching a secondary feed, "trying an alternate route through the maintenance corridor." I switched my attention immediately, recalculating their new approach vector. The maintenance corridor led directly toward the same secondary junction where Owen's team waited, a fortunate consequence of the station's layout rather than a planned outcome, but one that worked entirely in our favor. "Owen," I said into the comm channel, "they're rerouting through the maintenance corridor. Hold position. They're walking directly into your intercept point." "Copy that," he replied, his voice steady, despite the obvious tension in his tone. Minutes later, the unidentified force emerged into the narrow corridor exactly where Owen's team waited, the confined space eliminating any advantage their numbers might have offered. A brief, controlled engagement followed, ending quickly as their forward unit was subdued before they could fully realize the trap they had walked into. I monitored the situation carefully through the station's internal systems, coordinating additional pressure adjustments to isolate the remaining hostile forces still aboard their vessel, cutting off any possibility of reinforcement reaching the boarding party already contained within the corridor. Within 20 minutes, the entire situation had stabilized. The boarding party had been fully contained, their vessel isolated from the station through a combination of environmental barriers and sealed docking connections that prevented any further incursion. No civilian casualties. No losses among our own defensive team, the threat completely neutralized without a single unnecessary confrontation. Station defense forces arrived shortly afterward, taking custody of the contained hostiles and securing the disabled vessel for further investigation. As the situation resolved fully, the tension that had gripped the entire academy for the better part of an hour finally began to ease. Vrakith found me near the docking bay sometime later, standing quietly as station personnel worked to secure the area completely. He approached slowly, his expression carrying none of the sharp authority from earlier, replaced instead by something quieter, more contemplative. "Civilian casualties, 0, he said, reading from a datapad in his hand. Defensive team losses, 0. Hostile force, fully contained, without unnecessary confrontation. Yes, Sergeant, I said. He lowered the datapad slowly, studying me for a long moment in silence. You had no simulation parameters to guide you tonight, he said finally. No controlled variables, no predictable patrol routes, only real stakes and real consequences. That's correct, Sergeant, I said. And still, he said, the outcome mirrored everything you demonstrated during training. Delay, disruption, patience over aggression, ending resistance without unnecessary loss. It's not a technique I apply only under controlled conditions, Sergeant, I said. It's simply how my species approaches conflict whenever circumstances allow for it. Vrakith was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the now secured docking bay, the disabled vessel visible through the reinforced viewport nearby. I commanded no mercy the very first day I met you, he said slowly. I believed that meant overwhelming force, direct confrontation, absolute destruction of anything standing in opposition. I remember, Sergeant, I said. You showed me something different, he continued. No mercy toward hesitation, no mercy toward unnecessary risk, no mercy toward prolonging a conflict that could otherwise end quickly and completely. He turned to face me fully, something settling into his expression that I had never seen from him before, an acknowledgement that went beyond simple respect for results. Your species did not come to this coalition understanding less about war than the rest of us, he said. You came understanding something we had never needed to learn ourselves. What happens when a species runs out of patience for anything less than absolute, decisive victory? We paid a heavy cost learning that lesson, Sergeant, I said quietly. I would rather show it to you through results than through the kind of history that taught it to us. Vrakith nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, he offered a formal gesture of respect, a slight bow of his head that carried far more weight than any words could have conveyed. Cadet Hart, he said, you have completed your evaluation. Full marks, without exception. Thank you, Sergeant, I said. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back toward me one final time. I commanded no mercy, he said quietly. I did not expect a human cadet to be the one who finally showed me exactly what that meant. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving me standing alone near the quiet docking bay, the disabled vessel still visible through the reinforced viewport, the station slowly settling back into its usual calm rhythm around me. I stood there a moment longer, thinking about everything that had brought me to this point, every lesson my species had learned through painful, hard-fought history, now finally understood by a warrior culture that had spent centuries believing strength alone decided every conflict. Humanity had not joined this coalition to learn what mercy truly meant. We had come to show everyone exactly what happens when a species finally runs out of it.